Let's do the Outsider's Guide to Travel Bans. Now, Rita, we've heard this news earlier in the week that the Morrison government is saying, oh, you can't travel anywhere, you've got to stay, it's too dangerous. Is this really how a free society should behave?
Oh, absolutely not. We're the only democracy that has imprisoned its citizens. We're basically saying you cannot leave, you have to seek permission. And as we know, the overwhelming majority of people who are seeking permission to travel are having their requests rejected. And now the Morrison government is saying that all through next year, they don't want Australians to travel to Europe or America unless there's a vaccine. They want to have these travel hubs with other countries that don't have much infection. So I guess it'll just be Australia and New Zealand, because you could argue, well, you can't trust the stats of some countries. I just think that the whole concept of it is so backward and destructive. It's going to be damaging to our economy, but it's also infringing on the rights of our citizens. If you're willing to pay for quarantine, which you have to pay now out of your own pocket, the traveller does, if you're willing to submit to going into quarantine and paying for it, why should you be prevented from travelling to wherever you want to go? How is that in any way justifiable? It just shows me that we are completely at a loss to how to handle this crisis, and we're going to lock ourselves away from the rest of the world indefinitely.
Well, James, it disturbs me the more we hear this linkage between vaccines and you can do this, a vaccine, you can do that. The budget was built around the assumption of a vaccine. Now, I don't want to go all anti-vaxxer and into all that conspiracy theory stuff, but I do find it slightly disturbing, this constant linking of permission will be granted once a vaccine exists. Some elixir
and we're not even
from
guaranteed
heaven.
that. Yeah. And we're not even guaranteed that, all right?
And when does this become coercion? We once had Scott Morrison, James, telling us that vaccine would be mandatory till he realised that was unconstitutional, quickly backpedalled and said, oh, well, as mandatory as it can be. After what we've lived through and seen in the last 6 months, should we be getting a little bit nervous about this linkage?
Well, I think what we should be getting nervous about is the fact that this authoritarian response has become even more set in stone, and no one is standing up and saying, no, you know, I am old enough here, I don't want to show my age, but I'm old enough to remember in this pandemic panic, when the whole thing was about 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and the whole thing was about just keeping the hospital system from, I know, right? The hospital systems from being overwhelmed. And now it seems like, without actually saying so, Australia is going for a de facto elimination strategy, which simply does not work. Now, I want to tell you guys, I actually talked to New South Wales Health earlier this month, and I asked them what percentage, because I wanted to talk to them about this quarantine thing. And, you know, Rita was saying you should be able to go overseas if you're willing to pay for quarantine. I actually think that we need to even change this quarantine system. Of all of the tests that came back positive for people returning to New South Wales from overseas last month, 76% of them were picked up on that very first test. 24% presented later on in their isolation. I simply do not see why we cannot have a system where you are tested on arrival. Maybe you spend a day or two waiting for that result in a facility. And then, if that comes back clean, you can go home to your residence and quarantine there, just like if you were a close contact of somebody who was at a restaurant or some other establishment where they had also had a COVID transmission. And you should simply be treated like that if you've come back from overseas. That way you could be at home, you wouldn't have to spend the $3,000 on quarantine or whatever it costs. And also, crucially, we could start to let people come from overseas who have relatives who they might really want to see, and they'd be happy to come and quarantine in those relatives' homes. We need to start opening up this idea that the Prime Minister has said, you know, because for months he's been saying, oh, no, don't worry about the state borders. We'll have a vaccine soon anyway. It's not going to matter. Don't worry about the money. We're going to have a vaccine soon anyway. Suddenly, he's starting to admit that we're not going to have a vaccine soon. I mean, I'll take the vaccine. I've spoken to doctors. I've got no concerns about whatever comes out about it, but I simply don't think we're going to have it, and it's not going to be as effective as we think. Why are we not simply looking for the best treatments we can find?
Well, Rita, James raises questions there about quarantining and so on. But as you've always said, right from the beginning of the pandemic, way back in March, you know, what happened to herd immunity? And that was the path that Boris Johnson was going to go down initially, then backflipped and backtracked, and I think he would probably be regretting it. You look at the Swedish figures, they carry on getting better and better relatively to other countries, and they, of course, went for the herd immunity response. At what point, Rita, just because we're an island, do we think that we're just going to carry on forever without this? We're not going to travel, we're not going to let anyone in, we've got to have forced quarantines, force this, mandatory X, Y and Z. This is just insanity, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And we're 9 months into this crisis and we don't have a plan B. We really don't. The budget didn't have a plan B. We haven't heard a plan B from the Prime Minister. Everything hinges on a vaccine that's not only safe, but it gives you full coverage. Because if they develop a vaccine that's like the flu vaccine and only effective in 40 to 50% of cases, some flu seasons, the effectiveness of the vaccine is as low as 20%. So that's obviously not going to do it. Only a coronavirus vaccine that gives you wide coverage is going to be satisfactory. So to presume that that's around the corner is fanciful. They have never, ever developed a successful coronavirus vaccine. They've been trying to find a cure for the cold or find a vaccine since the 50s. Yes. Since the 50s. So, of course, huge resources have gone into it. We all hope and pray that a vaccine is around the corner, but surely any sophisticated country has a plan B. How are we going to live with this virus? How are we going to reopen our economies fully, reopen our borders fully without a vaccine? Because otherwise we're going to be a banana republic. We're going to be removed from the rest of the world. It'll be us and New Zealand just isolated whilst everyone else gets back into business.
Well, we would literally have to adopt a situation where we become this kind of exclusive little island that no one ever goes in or out of, some kind of science fiction weirdness, because
it would be an experiment.
Well, there you go. But it would be, as you say, there's no guarantee a vaccine would be effective. There's no guarantee a vaccine won't have side effects. There's also the question, which they were talking about recently on the radio, that, how long does your immunity last? So maybe it only lasts a few months. They're now touting this idea. So you'd have to, I guess, keep having a vaccine, do you? I don't know. But as you say, there is even not the faintest discussion in this country, yet around the rest of the world, this discussion is taking place, that really we should be just living with the disease, managing it amongst those who are vulnerable, putting our resources into that. As we discussed last week on Outsiders with Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, really, you can't stop this thing. You have to protect the vulnerable, who we know now to be the elderly. So the idea that anyone other than the elderly is at risk is fanciful nonsense. Sure, there's a tiny risk, but there's all sorts of risks in life. We don't not drive on roads because we're worried about the risk of a car crash, and we don't not eat in restaurants because we're worried about salmonella. James, the travel bans, this bubble idea. So, there are certain countries, so that's the next extension. You have a kind of two-tiered system, the exclusive little Australia, New Zealand, whatever bubble, and the rest of the infected, horrible world. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, again, I mean, I just think that this is ridiculous. You know, at some point, we are going to have to open up to the world. At some point, we are going to have faith that there are other medicines besides vaccines that can treat this illness. And at some point, we're also going to have to come to terms with the fact that, you know, as far as Farr's law, which is the bell curve that basically dictates the trajectory of pretty much every pandemic that's ever occurred, you know, these things do tend to die out themselves eventually. And this one may very well wind up dying out before we have a vaccine. And yet, the panic merchants in Canberra and a lot of the press, especially the lefty press and the ABC, will still be pushing the idea that there's, you know, nothing worse than coronavirus. This is the only thing that kills people. If we can only conquer coronavirus, then we can cancel death for all times. I do not think this idea works. We need to start to open up to the rest of the world, and we need to have a system to manage it, and eventually we are going to have to get back to normal. I do not want to hear the phrase new normal ever again.
I agree
because
with you.
That is a way of normalizing this totalitarian, authoritarian outlook. And I'll say one more thing, Rowan. A moment ago, you talked about Australia being, an island, but, we're not an island right now, Rowan. We're an archipelago. We are the Australian archipelago.
Yes.
And it is easier now for me to travel to the United States in 2 weeks than it is for me to travel to Queensland.
Yeah, extraordinary stuff. Rita, well, of course, you can't get out of that border, but you can get to the United States, and that'll be terrific.
But I'll just correct James there. I mean, and I think this is part of the problem, because those of us in the media are not subjected to the same conditions as most people. Whether you're talking about the 5 kilometre ban in Victoria, the radius you've got to stay in, or the curfew, media were exempt throughout. And same with travel. If media wants to travel, they get approval. But the ordinary person who wants to go to a loved one's funeral overseas, or to their son's wedding, or has some urgent business arrangement that they need to attend to, they get rejected. Media, tick, approved. So I think that's part of the problem and part of the reason why we're not seeing the agitation that we should be seeing, because it's just the ordinary people who's impacted, not those who
And what a disgrace that our public officers, our political parties do not represent the will of the people. And that's, I would say, a political party who started saying no to borders, no to these totalitarian measures would do really, really well.